Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to build the most prosperous place in the world. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs and to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 8, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. In this episode, we're joined by Ronald Richardson, a corporate director and private investor with active roles and investment interests in the technology, energy, space, and non-for-profit sectors. As a private investor, Ronald manages an investment portfolio of over 40 companies and is a member of the Capital Angel Network, an advisor to LSpark, SheBoot, and the Next 36 program cohorts. Ronald sits down with Scott to discuss the importance of board governance.
I am very excited to be interviewing Ronald Richardson on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship, this morning. The focus of our conversation today is about corporate governance and boards. And one of the things we were chatting about in the pre-taping kind of conversation is just the importance of corporate governance for society, be it from charities, from universities, for large corporations. So Ronald, at a very high level, what is the role of a board of directors?
The role of a board, it does depend on scale. So as a small company, if you own it yourself outright, you are effectively the controller and the shareholder. It's all you. But as soon as you start to introduce more than one stakeholder, generally the board starts to become more important. And as you scale up to not-for-profits, charities, small private, large private, even large public companies, now you have hundreds or thousands of stakeholders. So in general, it's three big things. The number one role of the board is make sure the right CEO is in the seat, that they're motivated and they're aligned to the business. So succession is job number one. Even if you've just appointed a new CEO, you want to be thinking about what happens with the proverbial bus. The second one is trust. So the fundamental problem with a corporation is something that's coined the agency problem. And I can get into that, but the third, I would say the role of the board is around support. So the board, sometimes it's perceived as this sort of evil, group of people that are out for bad. And really a board is on the same team. Everyone should be rowing in the same direction. And for a CEO, it's often lonely at the top. So as a CEO, a board can be there for you to sound out ideas. That can even extend to the senior leadership team. So again, big picture, CEO, the agency problem and trust, and really being a support role. And I can dive into the agency problem because it's, if you'd like.
That would be great, Ronald. I'd love to learn a little bit more about the agency problem.
Yeah, it's a corporation is a person at law. And this to me was it didn't register. But what happened back in early days of Britain, US, Canada, is they said, okay, let's create this thing called a corporation, which can act as a person, not a natural person, that's like you and I, but a person in the sense of under the law, they can open a bank account, own property, take legal action. And that entity exists beyond any one person. So when you say, I own my business, you don't technically. The business is its own person. You have certain rights to that business. So now, as a business grows, the owners are not necessarily the operators. So the owners provide, they give license to certain people, they hire people to run the business. So if I'm a shareholder of Corporation X, how can I trust that it's being operated in a responsible, honest, effective way if I'm not in the room? And that's kind of the crux of the agency problem. So the shareholders, they appoint a board. They also appoint auditors. And those are people that are sitting around the organization. The board hires the CEO. the board approves the budget, and the board delegates authority to the management team to operate against the budget. So that in its core is why a board exists. It's there to act on behalf of the shareholders, to make sure that the right person's in the seat, the CEO, that the operating plan makes sense, and that things are being handled practically and accountably. And then big picture, what does the board do? Like the role day to day or month to month? I love the characterization from ICD, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but they talk about the 3 lines of sight: hindsight, oversight, foresight. So most people are familiar with hindsight, and that's the idea that the board gets the financials, whether it's quarterly or yearly, receiving reports. That's mundane work. And weaker boards tend to focus on hindsight almost exclusively because it's easy. The second sight, oversight, that is more the governance label. So are there systems or controls in place to manage risk? Are we producing accurate financial statements? Those types of questions. And the third is arguably the most important and the most valuable, and that's foresight. So that ties into strategy and talent. So what is significantly different and important since our last meeting? Where are we going, right? What's our next step? And those types of conversations, I think, for the CEO and the leadership team, especially if you have a board that is informed on the industry, has some gray hair, that's all very helpful.
One of the paradigms I've increasingly heard of in the corporate governance space is the difference between strategic boards and generative boards, and actually more specifically, strategic discussions and generative discussions. So Ronald, for our listeners, can you describe what is a strategic conversation and what is a generative conversation?
Generative is actually not a word I've heard, but I kind of get the crux of the question. I mean, so at the root of it, a board, any person that's connected to a company has to act honestly and in good faith with a view to the best interest of the corporation. So that's kind of your job. When you're talking about discussions in a boardroom, a strategic discussion is one where, as I mentioned, you're really looking ahead. You're trying to keep the business a going concern. That's an accounting term for this business can pay its bills and continue operating. And ultimately, the idea of risk is sort of what could interrupt our plans, or what uncertainty could arise that could prevent us from achieving our objectives. So the strategic discussion is very much aligned to the forward-looking lens that you want to be applying, as opposed to discussions that are retroactive.
And to your point, it can be so much easier for boards of directors to look in the past. And I know this is something, sometimes an evolution we've gone through at Venture for Canada is trying to get our board packages to not just be all, this is what we've done, this is what's happened in the last 3 months, but more around, okay, what does the future of the organization look like? How do we bring in speakers from other organizations to share their external perspectives of the environment? How do we think about new ideas and generate new concepts? So one related question I have for you is, how can boards ensure that they are collecting sufficient information from their external environment? That in essence, the board isn't sort of siloed and losing insight about how external circumstances are rapidly changing, which could impact a business. So the question in a nutshell, Ronald, is how can boards ensure that they are taking into account changes in the external environment that may materially impact the organization that they govern?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's often a concept talked about, and that is the information gap. The idea that boards and directors are usually 80 to 90% reliant on management for the data they get. So it's very important also for boards to keep plugged in. So do the homework, stay consistently plugged in. I know some of the advice I tend to lean on is being part of everything from professional organizations staying busy, staying in industry. So keep a pulse, keep reading. And what you're trying to do as well is take the 30,000 foot view. I mean, having been an operator myself, in a capacity where you're in the weeds running the business, sometimes you hardly get a chance to take a breath. And ideally, your board is out there in the community, in the network, watching the landscape, and trying to provide not necessarily specific direction, but more questioning how the business's current strategy would fit into the changing landscape. So it's a question of just being informed and being engaged in the market that you're operating in.
Shifting back a little bit to one of the three areas of focus of board of directors, and that's the relationship between the CEO and the board of directors, of which there is arguably no other relationship that is more important in an organization. If that relationship's unhealthy, it's not a good sign for the whole org. If it's doing really well, then probably the organization's doing relatively well, if the governance is in a good place. So what advice do you have for both CEOs as well as boards of directors on how to foster an effective working relationship?
Right. So I guess a working relationship, let's, do you mind if we start with the CEO's relationship with the board of directors and then move from there into working relationship? Because I think that's often misunderstood. So in a corporate world, everyone has a boss, even the CEO, and the CEO reports to the board. So the board, as I mentioned, is responsible for making sure the right CEO is in that seat. So the board ultimately controls the hire fire decisions around the CEO or succession. They are responsible for incentivizing or the compensation for the CEO. And ultimately, the board has that accountability to shareholders. So with respect to the CEO and the board itself as a whole gives direction to the CEO, not individual directors. And that is a distinction that's often overlooked. So it can be very damaging if a director steps outside of the board and starts suggesting strategies or product direction, or interfering with the operations, or worst case, you're out in the field, you're talking to employees and you start making suggestions. That jumping of the org chart can be very disruptive to the operating management team. So when it comes to effectiveness, there's a lot of layers to how to be effective, but we can jump into that. So should we talk chairs, or should we talk about like highly effective chairs or whatnot?
Yeah, I think given the chair and the CEO relationship is particularly important, feel free to start with the chair.
Yeah, so the board chair, in some cases, if there's a controlling shareholder, they are themselves the chair. But ideally, the board elects a chair amongst the directors. So often that could be someone that has the most experience in the industry or the longest tenure with the board. The role of the chair is really to pull together talent, tone, and time. So those three pieces, talent around the boardroom table. I mean, obviously the CEO is one of those people, but there is an exercise when you're recruiting a board. You may have heard the term skills matrix, right? It relates to nomination and who do you want to succeed current directors, and what do you want your board to be? Who's in the room? And often a board of company A will look very different than company B because of where you're going, the market you're in, what you need around the table to truly help and be strategic. So that's the talent piece. From a tone perspective, I love the term tone at the top. So one of the key roles of not only leadership, but I would say it starts at the board level as well, is setting the tone for the organization. So if things are going to happen ethically and above board, that has to start right at the top. Board chair, is really the starting point for that. So a great board chair will be a listen first type person, driving meaningful discussion. They'll be there to own and understand the culture. And the third piece of that, time. So an effective board and an effective chair are really there to manage the time. So set the agenda for a board meeting, working with the CEO and the other board members to figure out what should be on the slate for our discussions in an upcoming meeting. What's most critical to the business? And going back to this idea of simply reviewing past financial statements, that's easy and passe. Instead, what are the challenges ahead of us, and how are we going to drive a meaningful discussion and make the right decisions given the landscape ahead?
What are some of the best practices that you recommend on how boards of directors can proactively work with the CEO to manage the risks that their organizations are facing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mentioned continue as a going concern, and the idea that risk is really the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And that line comes from ISO 31000. I also love the quote, "Never cross a river that is 4 feet deep on average." So risk management is really concerned with the extremes or the tails of a probability distribution, not their averages. There's also one, prevention is orders of magnitude cheaper than the cure, right? An ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. And last one on this is, if you must panic, it pays to panic early. So, I mean, that kind of underpins risk in general. I think something that's also a misconception, which I take to heart, is it's not the board or the leader or the senior leadership team that manage risk. Employees do. I know there's a study by Sydney Yoshida, which was called the iceberg of ignorance. And he concluded that 96% of problems are not known to senior management. There's all these cases about, like, how did the company not know that this was going to be a problem or could be a problem? So practically, what this means is having a process, right? We haven't really got into sort of oversight in detail, but having processes that bubble risk up to visibility at the board level, and that you have the right systems and tools and processes in place to deal with them. So that often looks like a risk matrix. It's usually refreshed annually. The board overall owns risk management, but sometimes it's spread out. So you mentioned being on committees. I mean, often the governance committee might own an enterprise-wide risk framework, make sure it's up to date. The audit committee usually gets involved overseeing financial matters and risk there. There's also, if you have an HRCC, like Human Resources and Comp Committee, that's often comp related and risk with HR. So there's all that side of it. And then depending on the level of sophistication, risk can take the form of sort of action plans. So there's ERPs, DRPs, like emergency response plan or disaster recovery plan. So if you perceive something to be real and you have the raw risk, but you have these tools or systems or mitigation in place, now you have a residual risk. Well, even if that happens, right, there's an event, or, I mean, we're getting through a pandemic. I like to say got through, but it's still around. Like, that was a paradigm shift for a lot of companies. It was tectonic. So who had pandemic on their risk matrix, and who was prepared, or was it one of these scrambling to catch up? So in some industries, the risks are pretty easy to spot. But the important part is having a plan in place so that as those scenarios start to show signs of being real, that you're not figuring it out live, that you've got a plan in place, that you have either practice in some scenarios, or you have thought through at least the bones of what you're going to do to recover.
We recently interviewed Stephen Pelosi, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, on this podcast, and that episode will be coming out as well. And that was one of the things he was talking about, is even if you're a central banker, for instance, and you're trying to anticipate what's going to happen in the economy, okay, well, there's a chance of recession, and maybe you say there's a 30% chance, but then there's also a good chance that there isn't a recession, that this is the lowest point. And at the end of the day, no one has a crystal ball. How do you, you can try to put a percentage on it, but it's also recognizing that but as you look to the future, there are an endless number of variables. There's an endless number of potential directions, and it's important to plan, in essence, for the worst case scenario, but also to plan a little bit of what happens if there's the best case scenario. One of the things he talked about is the importance of having, for businesses, to have a chief risk officer, but also to have like a chief opportunities officer. And I think this kind of relates to the core of our conversation a little bit around this risk. Is it's it's about mitigating risk, and it's about looking to the past, but it's also about what are all the opportunities that these risks can unlock. So my question for you, Ronald, is what can be the interplay between risk management and opportunity identification?
It's a great question. I love the idea of VP risk, right? As opposed to VP risk management. Like the idea is that risk gets owned, and risk is uncertainty in the future. But you're right. Risk is obviously the focus on the downside, but when a paradigm shift, or they refer to it as black swan event, or a major thing happens, in many cases that can present opportunities. So we often refer to it, in the boardroom, as having dry powder. So if you're a business that's able to acquire, or you have assets to move, sometimes being patient and waiting for these changes in the landscape puts you in a position to make very, very good strategic moves at a time when others might be flailing. So having dry powder is helpful. And there's a scenario planning exercise that I've seen done and participated in that basically looks at really outlandish potential futures, but what would have to be true to believe that that's happening. So you start working backwards from an outlandish future scenario, like the whole world is shut down in a full lockdown because of a pandemic, and then you work backwards to see what would be the early warning signs that is starting to happen. So here we are in a high interest rate environment. We're seeing certain economic indicators. If you are looking at it from an opportunity lens, you might already be 2 steps ahead. If you've thought through this is where the board discussing what members know about economies, the market, the way markets react to certain situations, you can be 1 or 2 steps ahead of the rest of the market and be very opportunistic at times of change. I mean, that is where really growth comes from. It's when things are moving and changing. So you're right. Risk is the downside, but change is paired with upside.
Yeah, it's an important thing to consider, that interplay between the two. It's often at times of the greatest uncertainty and change where there's also the most opportunities at the same time, because things are being fundamentally reordered and there's opportunity to build things anew. Something else that I'm intrigued about it, and I've been thinking about this phrase from Tony Robbins, even though I'm not necessarily a big Tony Robbins fan, and he once said that the quality of your life is the quality of your questions. And I think about this with the board, and I often find some of the board directors that can add the most value are the ones who really think through, okay, this is the 1 or 2 or 3 questions I'm going to ask in a specific meeting. And in researching this interview, there's, if you Google questions board should ask management, there's 100,000 articles and 100,000 different kinds of questions. And one of my questions for you, Ronald, is what are some of the critical questions that you think that boards should be asking management as part of their board governance responsibilities?
Yeah, often getting the question right is the most important thing. The right answers will follow, but you got to get the question right. So I 100% agree. So I would say that first and foremost, I love Peter Drucker's quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it doesn't matter how detailed or precise your strategy is. If you have a high functioning team, you're going to be on top. So that comes, I mentioned tone at the top. So first question, do we have the right tone at the top? Is our leader, like as a board, we have a role, but really it's senior leadership team and CEO. Are we setting the right tone for the organization, right? That relates to mission, vision, values. And are they practiced and are they walking the walk, so to speak? As far as other questions, I love the question, what keeps you up at night? So for either the CEO or certain departmental leaders in an organization, really fleshing out today or in the near future, what's making them sweat. That's always a good one, and that's pretty general. With respect to the board's oversight role, often you'll meet with your auditors in camera, which means without management present. And the question I usually reserve for that is, you're asking the auditors as a director, are there any questions you expected to hear from us but didn't? And what that usually unlocks is they'll say, well, actually, and they might share some information about the relationship or something they spotted, or, there might have been a delay or gap, that's sort of, you'll get quite quickly a sense of comfort, or you'll get your, spidey sense up as to whether or not you should be double clicking on anything. I think if you look through a standard board agenda, there's inherent questions all through that. We don't have to get into them, but some of the ones I'll just pull off the top are, I always like to ask, were there any significant departures from the plan and budget? Like, where are we significantly off what we thought we were going to do, and why? That's always a good thing to understand. Related to risks, which we just chatted about, I think there's always a connection. Do we have an appropriate control culture? Right? There's something to be said for having controls, but are we walking the walk, as I mentioned?
Those are great questions. And I particularly like that one is, are there any questions that you were anticipating that I asked that I didn't ask?
Expected to hear from us, but didn't. Yeah, or for me. No, it's a good one. And you know what, you'd be surprised. Like the in-camera idea is that you kind of pull people out of the room that might be conflicted or might, just their presence might impact some other person's freedom or comfort in saying, in presenting transparently, right? So in camera, it's a Latin term, but basically it's usually at a board meeting, best practice is to actually hold an in-camera with directors alone in advance of the meeting, like at the start. You've reviewed material, you sit down and you say, okay, looking around the table at people who are charged with governance only, not operations, so management's out of the room. Guys, what do we, or, I say that in the general neutral sense, but what do we think about what we've just read, going into this meeting? Are there any areas that we want to focus on? That's a really helpful way to align and have sort of a pre-discussion. And then often there's an in-camera at the end of the meeting with the CEO. So management steps out, the CEO is still at the table, and you can have a more focused discussion on HR or certain sensitive topics that might not be appropriate to share with others in the room. And then usually you finish the meeting with an in-camera, just the directors, the independent directors who are not part of management. And again, that's a point where any final thoughts from directors, the chair can take back to the CEO and say, hey, by the way, without attribution, of course, you're not letting the CEO know who thought what, but you say the board has a concern about X, or the board has a recommendation Y, whatever it is. So those are not necessarily questions, but they're structures in governance that allow the right questions to come out.
And the right questions are so critical for, I think, any board as it governs the whole conversation, ultimately what the focus of a meeting is going to be. To wrap things up, Ronald, at a high level, what are the attributes of a high functioning board, and what are the attributes of a low functioning board?
Great. So a high functioning board, it's kind of like a marriage. So a high functioning board is going to look like a performing team. I mean, largely running on time, members show up informed, people are independent, right? They should demonstrate independence. They would bring their experience to the table. I mentioned integrity already. A great board, they'll have substance and style, depth, demeanor, gravitas, grace. Those are all words that come to mind. Often, obviously, respectful, and psychological safety is a concept. I know Google introduced it, but in general, it's that there is no that any thought is respected and can be shared. So that allows for transparent, open discussion, and board members feel that their concerns or their thoughts are welcomed. And I think that that's essential to good governance. It's essential to a high functioning board. You mentioned dysfunctional. So I love the line, the fish usually rots from the head. And I mentioned marriage. So like a dysfunctional board resembles a failing marriage. So I was part of a board of a startup, and it was 3 founders that were all together. And it actually came from the merger, a cashless merger of 2 prior entities, 2 companies, 2 founders on one side, one on the other. In that case, this was just a textbook example of a highly dysfunctional management team, but also board, because they were on the board as well. There was trust issues, power struggle. One of the founders, who was not in the CEO position, was trying to constantly usurp the CEO. There was contempt, there was jealousy, stonewalling in meetings, like information not being shared. There was back channel conversations and what I would call jumping. So, member of the management team was talking to board members to try to sort of even gaslighting. Like it can get very, very ugly. That's worst case. There are dysfunctional boards, which in ICD, we talk about a controlling CEO. So often an owner, majority owner, controlling shareholder can lead to a situation which may or may not be dysfunctional, meaning the board is there on a perfunctory basis. They're not actually there with full autonomy or being able to exercise or demand what a board should be entitled to. So that kind of touches on it. At law, a dysfunctional board is only, and this comes a little bit out of Delaware case law, but it applies to Canada too. A board does not get in trouble for failing to predict the future. So business outcomes are not the responsibility of the board, but rather to not have the right systems or processes, or failing to attempt to collect the information from those systems and actually understand it. So if you're not implementing any reporting or information systems, or if you've implemented them but consciously fail to monitor or oversee them, that is where you've failed in a capacity as a director. So that's another type of dysfunctional board that can happen.
And as I think we have all learned over the last couple of decades, is corporate governance is so critical for the success of all institutions, from the recent Hockey Canada scandals that have happened this year to the collapse of Enron, to Elizabeth Holmes, who, even though she had some of the most well-known people in the United States on her board of directors. There was still massive amounts of fraud, and the list goes on. It can happen in any institution, be it a religious institution to a large corporation to a a private school. Corporate governance failures happen all the time, and to our listeners who are largely young Canadians that are beginning to start their careers, as you advance, I think one of the things that's so critical is to think about developing corporate governance skills. And how can you do that even in your 20s and further it in your 30s and 40s? And to start young, recognizing that if you're going to be in a leadership role, and even if you're not going to be a director later on, having some knowledge of what is good governance will help you in so many different roles in your careers. And I think Ronald shared a ton of really wise insights and actionable takeaways for listeners to think about as you think about the future of developing corporate governance skills. Ronald, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a true pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise, the pleasure is all mine. Thanks, Scott.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture for Canada, or email us at podcast@ventureforcanada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Sturrett. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful.